Paul Zalkin, a partner in our restructuring team, interviews aviation experts from the Airline Management Group on the impact coronavirus has had on the sector. Peter Davies is the CEO of Airline Management Group. Ben Leon is Airline Management Group's Chief Commercial Officer. Augusto Viansson Ponte is Director of Strategy and Planning at Airline Management Group. Part 3. The aviation industry supply chain.
It's a complicated industry. And I mean, when you actually sit and you sort of think, well, what are all, if you think about sort of the vertical integration within the airline industry and all the suppliers that feed into it, I mean, it's immense, it's huge. And in the UK, we've got a very active airline sector, but we also are part of the manufacturing supply chain as well within the UK. Rolls-Royce, engine manufacturer, one of the main aircraft engine manufacturers. Airbus Industries has a plant in the UK, which, as we know, produces the wings for Airbus Industries. In Northern Ireland, in Belfast, Bombardier, a much smaller manufacturer producing mainly business jets, but nonetheless. And obviously all of the other sort of high-tech manufacturing organizations which feed into all of that. So very important for the UK. But then we have the airport and all of the ground handling, the catering, security. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. At the present time, when the entire sector and the airline industry is effectively ground to a halt, I mean, the impact on the supply chain, I don't know which one of you wants to pick that up, but just to talk in general terms about how pervasive that impact is going to be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's a significant question because it brings in a whole number of strands that we've been referring to earlier. Clearly, the knock-on impact is going to be immense if there's a reduction in capacity. But at the same time, I'm an optimist by nature, and we have to be in my job. And every cloud has a silver lining. So there will be some fundamental changes in how the capacity is deployed. You'll find that often within direct airline business, the caterers and everything else that falls out of that, there tends to be a relativity between the number of passengers and the unit cost. So therefore, if you've got less passengers, the unit cost will go up. So the suppliers will be forced into reducing their charges somehow. But there's a more fundamental opportunity here, I believe. And that is with the reduction, as you're currently seeing, in the type of equipment that's flying, the big A380 Airbus and the 747s, many of which are now grounded permanently. There's a strong argumentation that some will never fly again, therefore aiding and abetting the natural reduction in capacity. That will spur on perhaps a different model within the airline industry in terms of more what we call point-to-point traffic. Therefore, the Boeing 787, the Airbus A350, which are coming through in their droves and have been in the last 4 or 5 years and having a significant impact in terms of aircraft economics, airline economics, and passenger comfort. They're quite good aeroplanes to fly on. So whilst we talk about a long tail, I do see that there's going to be a shift in the model whereby perhaps that type of aircraft, which is economically viable, starts to fly passengers point to point, which in turn means they don't have to go through condensed hubs, as Ben was referring to. You can then also introduce a strand linking in the bio, which brings in a whole new industry into the aviation sector. I know the Scandinavians have been working for many years now on biometrics through eye. Is it possible you can add your medical condition to your bio, so when you do go through, you know you've been checked for whatever. So I think that there's clearly opportunities abound for a shift in the model in terms of new industries or other industries converting themselves into taking opportunities. So it's not all doom and gloom. The immediate impact, I come back, is the short term, and having gone through the short term, the long recovery. Can they sustain the levels of liquidity? But I think the knock-on impact in aircraft manufacturing, level engines, components, is significant because already leaving the Boeing 737 MAX to one side, and that's complications. Many people are now, particularly the lessors, the banks, are now substantially reducing their orders. And clearly Airbus and Boeing's are going to, this may be a saviour in Boeing in sort of in an ironic way. So the capacity will simply be reduced, and in terms of aircraft flying, that will be matched with the OEMs. They'll survive, no question about it. But what I'm trying to say is it does force you, and the airline industry is particularly good at this, and Ben alluded to it, it does force us into situations where you then have to make changes. And if I can just use 30-second example of the NHS, got nothing to do with this, but the principle is the same. The Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital is not too far from where I have. We got some medical friends there, and they are astounded at the way that the processes and procedures that the medics have been trying to persuade the management to change over the last 15 years has been done in 15 weeks. So where there's a will, there's a way. And certainly our industry is very innovative. It's highly technical. Technological advances will spring out of this, fuel, biometrics. So I think there's a great future in terms of opportunities. We just need to see ourselves get through this stage.
So this, in many respects, is the sort of the catalyst to precipitate a change in behaviours. And you know, we all know the story of the Airbus A380, which technologically was a fantastic aircraft, etc., but commercially has been a failure. Effectively, that fleet is slowly being grounded. Emirates, who were the main acquirer of the Airbus A380, is I think cancelling potentially its last few orders. So we're going to potentially see sort of the mass grounding of the very large, high capacity, wide body jets like the A380, like the 747, which is now a very old aircraft and in its probably fourth or fifth iteration. So that could become sort of a permanent thing. I mean, literally, what do you do with all of these aircraft which are now being left on the ground? They go and sit in a desert somewhere and then eventually get chopped up, or I mean, what happens there?
Well, yeah, some get chopped out. I mean, I think Ben's got his more accurate numbers than I have in terms of, I think it's the number of man hours required to personnel, should I say, to keep an aircraft on the ground. It's immense, and Ben can comment in a minute. Some of these aircraft will be converted into cargo carriers. I mean, you have to accept that the inventiveness of the airline industry, particularly people like British Airways and some United Airlines, where they're converting their 777, 777s into cargo aircraft, but leaving the passenger seats in. There's a lovely photograph that Alex Cruz put out the other day of a 777, belly full and seats full of packages. So that's the temporary inventiveness. But these aircraft often will simply be parked up and or eventually go for scrap. But I think the cost to the airline, you can't just park an aeroplane up like you can. Well, if you take your own car and you don't start it for 6 weeks, you'll have a flat battery. So you multiply that by all the systems and the electronics and the complications, aside from safety, then it's a massive job. And certainly the older aeroplanes will simply not fly again.
So Ben, I mean, we spoke briefly the other day and you were explaining about the complexity of restarting, you know, an airline generally, the sector generally, and in particular, you did mention the cost of temporarily grounding an aircraft and, you know, making sure that it is protected from the elements and all of its systems are shut down and decommissioned in the appropriate way. The reverse of that, when you need to start it up again, it takes a huge number of man hours, and that's just the aircraft themselves. I mean, we're talking about a complex, you know, chain that needs to be restarted. Talk us through that a little bit. I mean, when everything comes back online, what are the main challenges there?
Well, absolutely. The decommissioning or grounding of aircraft, on average, for an average aircraft is around 400 man hours for an aircraft to be decommissioned and grounded in terms of as a wide body aircraft. And as you said, Paul, it's every single item has to be carefully conserved. The seats have to be covered. The engines have to be be guaranteed to be safe. Things like you have to stop birds nesting on them. You actually have to keep the wheels turning every day, because otherwise the pressure on the wheels will cause a deformation. So it's about 400 man hours to park and ground an aircraft, and it will take approximately the same amount to actually bring them back on board as well. The other factor that airlines are contending with is in terms of what to do with all of their staff at the moment. I think Virgin leads the way here in terms of having given their staff the opportunity to go and volunteer for the NHS, and a significant number of them have gone to volunteer at the Nightingale hospitals, and that is extremely commendable. But one of the factors for the airline industry that relates back to the safety issue is the training and the recency for both the pilots and the crew and the maintenance engineers. And depending on how long these aircraft are going to be sitting on the ground, and depending on how long staff are going to be furloughed, there will be a ramp up requirement in terms of recency of licenses. And there are only so many simulators, aircraft simulators out there. So depending on how quick the recovery is going to be, each airline is going to have to manage its resource pool, which is already a complicated factor of managing your resources, both in terms of safety, fatigue management, and the various different union agreements that you have. But now in terms of recency of flying and maintaining those flying hours to stay safe. So that's a whole consideration for each airline, depending on how many aircraft they grounded, depending on what their crew are doing at the moment, and then the whole mechanics of making sure each of those aircraft are then fit to fly again. So it is a operational masterpiece that needs to take place.
Yeah, and it strikes me, thinking about it from a sort of a business and restructuring perspective, and this is perhaps the experience across a lot of different sectors that we're advising in and that I'm advising in. It's interesting to see the impact of the immediate stimulus measures that have been put in place by the government, particularly furlough. And in the hospitality and leisure sector, where grants are available from local authorities, depending on where your particular property sits in terms of its rateable value, those sums of money are what is enabling these businesses to weather the storm. You know, the turnover tap is switched off, fixed costs and overheads continue and have to be managed. But if you get a bit of a shot in the arm because you get a £25,000 grant for each of your leisure units and you can furlough your stuff, that's absolutely fine. It's how we come out of that and how businesses, when they're no longer receiving that stimulus, how they manage it. And that will be what's going to be very, very interesting. And it is telling that on the sort of side of our business that will deal with insolvency and restructuring, now is not the time when we're seeing huge numbers of businesses failing, because actually they're all protected, they're mothballed. It's what happens going forward. You know, if, for instance, Airbus and Boeing only slowly ramp up their manufacturing capacity and therefore hugely scale down the demand for certain parts, that's a very difficult thing for the supply chain, their supply chain to manage. Equally, as you say, if we're just looking at pilots and pilot training, you know, it's how you feed people back into the system when they need to get simulator time, when they need to, you know, they're basically out of hours, as it were. So that, I think, is when it's actually going to be for the whole aviation sector. Augusto, I mean, again, as a strategist, I don't know what your sort of views and thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is going to be the case, I believe. On one side, you have like the protection schemes right now that would sort of like hold them together. But as soon as like you open the tap, like it will be open market again. You will probably see competition starting, and therefore like it's going to go back like to survival of the fittest. I mean, this is a cutthroat industry, as Peter was saying earlier. So you will inevitably go back to that behavior and to see like what the outcome of that is going to be. But also more important, it's how deeply and permanently affected the industry will be going forward. I mean, right now, a lot of the schemes that we're seeing like being put in place and a lot of the reaction that we're seeing being put in place by the various airlines almost appear to indicate or point towards the fact that a lot of people like expect like business like to come back like as almost as usual within 3, 6, 9, whatever months. Reality may well be that it's going to be a lot more complicated. And yes, when you open the tap is only going to be half open, yep, rather than fully open. And that schemes that have been put in place to survive for X many months and then like fully reopen the tap will not be sufficient to deal with the situation going forward. You will also have, I would suspect, different speeds at which various regions across the world will reopen their taps and will allow their companies to get back into the market, which will fundamentally, I think, reshape the way the industry globally will look like, because certain regions may open earlier and may react in a better way than others, or may reopen too early and be immediately exposed to an environment that they are not ready for. So all of those will need like to be scenarios that need to be evaluated and looked at. So yes, quite a difficult scenario to paint properly going forward.
I think one point in this whole period of crystal ball gazing is an important factor for airlines, but really for any business in the value chain, is really to take stock of all of those things that really should be on the to-do list and get them going. And one of the factors which we spoke about before is the consumer demand. So really it's incumbent on each of the of the airlines right now and each of the companies in the value chain to be thinking about how are they communicating with their customers, how are they maintaining engagement with their customers, how is that brand represented right now during this unprecedented time, and how are they behaving towards their customer base, because that will have an impact on customer reaction when the tap starts to open. So the brand and how the airlines and how each of the companies in the value chain are behaving towards their own customer base will play a part. And the second part is an internal one, which is what Peter alluded to, is in a crisis, what is the state of the leadership and the management in each of these organizations, and what are the soft skills that are going on in terms of maintaining staff engagement during this extremely difficult time. And what's the communication level like from senior management down to the shop floor? What is it that the management are doing to maintain staff ideas, and maybe all of the things of process changes that were put on the back burner in the past? Maybe now is the time to be looking at those. And so it's really the calm period right now, which has seen the sort of crisis of management in terms of a lot of operational reactivity. But depending on how long this tail is going to be, is how fundamental changes can be made by the right leadership within each of the organizations.
Paul, you asked specifically about the supply chain. I think one of the things that we're trying to build into the model, and we're some way away, is that pre-COVID-19, roughly, there was around 11,000 aircraft commercial passenger aircraft airborne at any one time, roughly. 8.5 to 11,000 was the spread, depending upon where the sun was and what holidays were going on at the time. But generally, so it's not beyond the realms of mathematical logic that if you feel, and we feel no figures specifically, but we're working on that, if capacity, when it comes back, assuming it comes back so that everyone's allowed to fly again, whenever that is, then there's going to be a reduction of, say, 30% capacity. Simplistically, take 30% of 10,000 average flights. You've got 3,000 flights at any one time, not airborne. So we can work that into our model in terms of, well, you know, what's the consequences of that? Because we understand, obviously, all the macroeconomics surrounding the cost of flying an aeroplane. And that will begin to establish a sort of macro figure, admittedly a bit, you know, pie in the sky, but at least there's some intelligence surrounding it. And from that, I think we should be able to, and I'm not aware of anyone doing this, and perhaps we should talk about this, is what's the logic in terms of down through the supply chain? So if you multiply 3,000 flights by so many passengers, and let's say, I don't know, average of 150 packs, obviously there's more short-haul aircraft, well, I don't know, we need to do the mathematics. But you can find that there's an awful lot of people not flying anymore. And therefore catering, all the unit costs, the footfall through duty-free, which you're forced to go through on a 4-mile hike around the terminal, which really annoys me, especially when I've got a bad back. And all the other consequences which you can link in. It doesn't take much to create a tree of consequence, if you like. And I thought we could have, you know, put some numbers around that. I'm sure that our friends in IATA, and I know that we have, as I said, other economic colleagues or economists who can do those computations as well as the work that we're doing. It'd be an interesting scenario to paint. And I think when you do that and then try and estimate the length of time or the length of the tail, I think most people would have a pretty big fright.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think the impact of this is going to be felt for an incredibly long time, and it's going to fundamentally change the industry. And I think, you know, it's interesting because I take your point that when you go into a turnaround situation and you're confronted with an airline and you've been brought in to try and deal with it, you are sort of slightly ahead of where we would typically be as restructuring and insolvency professionals when something has actually gone wrong.
Yeah.
And, you know, the problem has crystallized, and our job is to try and preserve as much value as possible at that point and try to recover something of the situation. The subtlety of that sort of behavioural piece, which you have to do, you know, and I mean, you guys in particular are going to be sort of uniquely placed.
In the fourth and final part, Paul and his guests will look ahead and discuss the changes to behaviours that may be necessary and how that will impact the industry. You can watch this on the Quantuma and Airline Management Group's websites and LinkedIn channels. Thank you for watching this episode. For further information, you can contact Paul Zalkin and Quantuma via the links below this film.